Okay, so how you would structure your AO1, apologies, I'll just briefly go back over that because it got interrupted. So your AO1, you would have your definition, you'd have an example and how you'd link them together. For example, in biological reductionism is the reducing down of behaviours to its simplest biological parts. For example, OCD is high levels of is caused by high levels of dopamine and low levels of serotonin. This is an example of biological reductionism because it's reducing the very complex behaviour of OCD down into its simplest biological forms, serotonin and dopamine, which are neurotransmitters. It feels repetitious, but it's a really good way of demonstrating your knowledge. So when you're thinking about AO1 from now on, definition, example, link it back. Okay. Refer to at least 2 topics of your studies. That's your AO1. Your AO2 is sort of like your AO2 is refer to at least 2 topics you have studied in your answer. So you must talk about topics, and this is part of the mark, so you need to give your examples in detail. So if you just say, for example, classical conditioning, you're not going to get very far. You need more detail in those. And of course your evaluation points, a strength is, this is a strength because, a strength is, for example, this is a strength because, and you always want to start with your key point, one short sentence. You want to give an example. In your example, you want to again demonstrate how that links back to the AO3 point. So and we'll have a look at those in a little bit, and then you want to explain this is a strength because, and then you want to link it back to, in this case, the debate, but always link it back to the question. So you want to be talking about finishing with the impact that this evaluation point has on the nature-nurture debate or reductionism and holism. Okay, and here is the mark scheme. So you break it down. For the top band, you would need knowledge of nature-nurture debate is accurate and generally well detailed. So you need to not make any mistakes, and you need to have a fair amount of detail. The nice thing about generally well detailed is that it's acknowledging that there is some detail. Generally, it's generally well detailed, but it doesn't have to be all of the details. So they're not expecting you in 16 marks to be able to be incredibly detailed. The next one is that it's evident with some occasional inaccuracies. So as soon as you start making some mistakes in your answer, then you're possibly being pushed down to the lower marks, to band 3. Knowledge is present and focuses mainly on description. So a lot of the talk is on description, and you haven't got as much evaluation, or the nature-nurture debate is limited, and this means you haven't got very much detail in there at all. Now, it is a holistic thing, so it will pull between them. So you could have really, really good AO1, but then poor AO2 and AO3, and that might drag it down, or vice versa. It might pull it up if you had some excellent AO3 marks in there as well. Okay, you've got discussion is thorough, and that would mean you have a really clear, you have your strength is or your weaknesses with a statement. You'd have an example, you would link the example back to the strength or the weakness, and then you would link you would finish the point off by saying this is a strength or this is a weakness because, and you would link it back to the debate or to the question. You would need to do that with all 3 of your evaluation points, okay, to get the marks. You'd also need to be clear, coherent and well structured. For your discussion is apparent and the topics are mostly effective. So if we're thinking about mostly effective, that means your structure's there, but occasionally, so some of your points are really good, and if they're all like that, they'd be in the top band, but there's also some that maybe either don't finish off the this is a strength because sentence, or aren't effectively linking the example back to the question, to the this is a weakness is. And then you've got some knowledge of the nature-nurture debate is present. Any discussion or use of topics is only partly effective. So this would mean that most of the time you haven't got your this is a strength because sentences, or they're not very good and they're not linking back to the description. So that's important as well. Or it's limited, you haven't got any discussion at all, and that's band 1, or it's poorly focused and absent. And if you have a look as well, its structure makes a difference. So it needs to be well structured, clear, coherent and focused to be at the top. In the middle it's mostly clear and organised, and then in the other answer it lacks clarity, accuracy and organisation. So if I'm saying that, that's possibly what's affecting your mark there. Okay, so these are the this is an essay structure for nature versus nurture, so you can check check the information in there. And as you can see, I've carefully selected the topics automatically are woven into your AO1. If I had any comments on this, I'd like you to go back to the flipped learning for nature versus nurture and make some notes. Lots of people didn't, in fact nobody talked, I don't think, about MZ and DZ twins in enough detail, so explaining MZ and DZ twins and 100% of their DNA and 100% of their environment, or 50% of the DNA and 50% of their environment. So I'd like to listen to nature versus nurture flipped learning or the biological approach flipped learning to make some notes on that as well. And the same with the evolutionary approach. Go back to the biological approach and have a listen to that, or have a listen to the nature-nurture flipped learning, because that's something to really focus on. And lots of people with nurture didn't go into enough detail about attachment or social learning theory, so we might need some more detailed examples in there. So that's what I'd want you to put in. And what I'd say a key thing about the structuring here is, you'd say a weakness of the nature-nurture debate is that siding with one side of the debate or the other can lead to very negative, can have a negative impact or negative consequences. You don't have to use the phrase negative impact. You say ethical, could raise some ethical issues. And then you say, for example, eugenics. So the nature-nurture debate itself doesn't lead to eugenics. Holding a nature side of the viewing just the nature side of the debate can lead to people to hold beliefs about eugenics. Again, have a listen to the flipped learning if you need to. An issue with the nature-nurture debate is that both sides rely quite heavily on twin studies to pull apart the differences between nature versus nurture. So that's what you'd want to talk about. If you didn't talk about them in much detail in your AO1, then this AO3 point won't be as effective. So talking about shared and unshared environments, and also generalizability. So the two things here: first of all, you want to have the twin studies in your AO1, so make sure you've got that. Secondly, you want to make sure you want to link it back to the nature-nurture debate at the end. Okay, so make sure you're introducing it correctly. Both the nature and the nurture debate rely on twin studies, which do have some methodological issues, which don't allow us to tease apart nature versus nurture as much as we might have hoped. And then you've got those examples, and then you need to tell me what an issue with that is. Well, for example, therefore we can't be confident of any conclusions drawn on either of the nature or the nurture side of the debate based on twin studies, because the research lacks validity, and therefore potentially the conclusions drawn lack validity. And then the interactionist approach, most of you did this. I think it was more that you started to run out of time, so you could approach it in any way that you wanted to, but I would say that a strength of the discussion about the nature versus nurture debate is the development of the interactionist approach, which is the interaction between nature versus nurture. And then you've got the example. What a few of you didn't do with the example is you didn't explain what part of the diathesis stress model was nature and what part of it was nurture, and how they work together. Or you could use your epigenetics there as well with the mice, which was very well explained when you did explain it, but it's all the stuff around it at the beginning and at the end, linking it back to the debate. And of course, the strength of the interactionist approach is that we can more effectively explain all human behaviour, which is the aim of psychology, therefore increasing the validity of any debates, because we're acknowledging both sides of the debate, rather than just one, which can only explain a certain amount of the behaviour, whereas considering both nature and nurture can consider all of the behaviour, and therefore increasing validity. Holism versus reductionism. Most of you gave a good explanation of reductionism, which was good. The only thing I would say, Occam was a monk from the 13th century, so unfortunately he didn't nip down, as much as I'd love it to be true, he didn't actually nip down to Superdrug and have two razors he had to choose between. Occam's razor just means Occam's law, Occam's theory, Occam's concept, Occam's rule, something like that. So it's not actually a physical razor, it's just a theoretical way of thinking about things. So just be careful about the way that you explain that. Also, keep it simple. Stupid is a good way of remembering it, but it's not particularly psychological, so you'd want to be referring to the psychological elements too. You've got the levels of explanation, and I would talk about, so it does say from the highest to the lowest level, but I'd be tempted to say from the most to the least reductionist level. And at each point you would want to either talk about OCD or memory, and you would want to demonstrate, so you'd explain what they are, each one of those things are, and you would have the same example running throughout all three. So maybe have another listen to the video and see how OCD can be used for biological, psychological and cultural and social, or how memory can be used for all of those three as well. and make it clear. So the same thing again. This biological explanation is the lowest level. For example, OCD says this. This links to the biological level because. So you want to explain why this is an example of the biological explanation. What I would say is that you, for most of you, this was an issue of this is everything you need to know for holism and reductionism. However, really, it's more about, if you think about it, it's accurate and generally well detailed. So I would go for picking, say, a definition of reductionism and then holism, and you can put that at the beginning or the end if you want, and then the levels of, maybe go for the levels of explanation in lots and lots of detail, or biological reductionism and environmental reductionism in lots and lots of detail. And then you've got a definition of holism. So Gestalt psychology is an example of a holistic approach to explaining human behaviour, and they have that quote there. And then you've got the examples of either cognitive approach or the humanist approach as well. The negative impact, so once again, a negative impact of taking a reductionist approach to explaining behaviours is that we can miss higher levels, or we can't explain things as effectively. And then you've got WOLP, and the key thing you want to do is identify that WOLP, systematic desensitization, was mostly an environmental type of reductionism because of the anxiety about insects. Whereas, so because of that, the treatment wasn't effective. Whereas, if they'd focused on the cultural or the social element of reductionist element, then they might be able to treat it. So reducing it down sometimes means that we miss a different level of explanation, and maybe, and then you could argue that perhaps a more holistic approach would be more appropriate for that. So distraction from a more appropriate level, suggesting that in general, a psychological approach that takes a reductionist approach. So reductionism in itself isn't an approach like biological or environmental or behaviourist or anything like that. But it's an approach that other approaches adopt. Then maybe a more holistic approach might be appropriate. With animal and human studies, the key things I would say is, don't think, oh goodness, I'm on something I'm going to feel more confident about. You need to contextualise it and link it back. So make a real clear, good argument for why non-human and animal why humans and animals are very different, and also you need to link it back to what impact that has on the debate. So if the research that the environmental reductionism is based on lacks validity, then that suggests that any conclusions drawn by any approaches which use environmental reductionism also lack validity or call into question the validity of them. And then the interactionist approach, the most important thing here is not that it's a mixture between it's not an interaction between holism and reductionism. They are so different. They're like oil and water. They cannot be mixed. Reductionism completely rejects holism completely rejects experimental research. Reductionism says the only way to develop any theories is to conduct research. There's no way of combining those. So the interactionist approach is a mixture of the levels of explanation. So acknowledging that it's not only a biological, but it could be biological and environmental, and that brings in nicely to the diathesis stress model. And again, you want the example of the diathesis stress model, but you also want to tease it apart. So we have the genetic propensity, which would be biological reductionism, but there also needs to be environmental triggers, which would be environmental reductionism as well. And then finally, the impact that has. Well, the interactionist approach, you could argue it either way, but you could want to say it's a strength because it allows us to explain more human behaviours in more detail, more effectively, suggesting that psychology as a whole and any research that uses or debate approaches that use an interactionist approach have higher validity, as they're more effectively able to explain the behaviour.